In this lesson, we will be discussing the New England colonies of English North America. The New England colonies, big idea is that English colonists traveled to New England to gain religious freedom. Main ideas are that the Pilgrims and Puritans came to America to avoid religious persecution in England. Religion and government were closely linked in the New England colonies. And the New England economy was based on trade and farming. Also, education was important in the New England colonies. Main idea one, the Pilgrims and Puritans came to America to avoid religious persecution. Puritans wanted to purify or reform the Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England. Hence their name. They're called Puritans because they wanted to purify the church and remove any Catholic influence that still remained after the Church of England was formed. The Pilgrims, on the other hand, believed that the church was corrupt, that it could not be saved. They wanted to separate from the Anglican Church altogether and basically not have anything to do with it. Some pilgrims left England to escape persecution. They became immigrants, or people who leave the country of their birth to live in another country. The differences between Pilgrims and Puritans we can see on this chart right here. Pilgrims were few in number. Puritans were many. The Pilgrims left England early in 1620. The Puritans left later in 1629 to 1630. The Pilgrims came from a poorer class of people, whereas the Puritans were upper middle class. Now, because the Pilgrims were poor, they actually had to sign contracts of indenture to get themselves transported across the Atlantic Ocean. And they signed that contract of indenture with the Virginia Company, which is going to be important here in a few minutes. Pilgrims tended to be uneducated, whereas the Puritans were educated. The Pilgrims they were separatists from the state church. The Puritans remained loyal to the state church, however, they wanted to improve it. The Pilgrims would settle in an area along the Massachusetts coast called Plymouth, and the Puritans would settle in what would become Salem and Boston. The Pilgrims were led by William Bradford and William Brewster, and the Puritans were led by John Winthrop, John Endicott, and Miles Standish. The Pilgrims first. The Pilgrims originally immigrated from England to the Netherlands, but they would end up leaving the Netherlands in 1620 on board the Mayflower, a ship that was contracted by the Virginia Company. And the reason why the Pilgrims left the Netherlands actually had to do with their children. The children of these English immigrants in the Netherlands they learned how to speak Dutch. They were adopting Dutch styles of dress and habits, and these English Pilgrims wanted their children to be properly English. They didn't want them to be Dutchified, and so from their point of view, the best way to avoid their children or to keep their children from becoming Dutch was to leave the Netherlands, sign contracts of indenture, so that meant they would be indentured servants, and there they would be transported to Virginia, which was a English colony in North America, and then they would not have that Dutch influence over them. They signed a document called the Mayflower Compact. This was a legal contract in which they agreed to have fair laws for the colony. And the reason why this contract became necessary is because they didn't end up in Virginia. The Mayflower was caught in a storm in the Atlantic Ocean, was blown far off course. They never made it to Virginia. Instead, they ended up off the coast of what is today Massachusetts, which is hundreds of miles to the north of where the Virginia colony was at. And that meant that they were outside of the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. They were in a completely new environment, and the Mayflower basically abandoned them there to their own devices, and that meant that they had to learn to govern themselves. There wasn't anybody that was going to be enforcing the law from outside, so they had to create laws of their own. They arrived at Plymouth in present-day Massachusetts in November 1620, and there they established a colony of their own, even though that's not what they originally intended to do. Originally, they intended to go to Virginia, where they would work off their contracts of indenture and eventually earn their freedom. More than half of the settlers died during that first winter. It was a winter that they were completely unprepared for. They did not have the necessary supplies. They did not have the necessary lodging. They had to adapt to the environment in which they found themselves, and many of them couldn't adapt, and as a result of that, they died. They were fortunate in some sense that the area that they landed in was not heavily populated. They actually landed near an abandoned Native American village, and there were two Native Americans that befriended them, Samoset and a man named, who's come down to us in history, they call him Squanto, but his name was Tisquantum. Squanto was interesting in that he had some previous experience with the English. Squanto had actually been kidnapped by merchants, probably Dutch, along the Massachusetts coast sometime around maybe 16, 16. He was taken to the Virginia colony, where it's believed he may have made the acquaintance of Pocahontas. And then he ended up in Europe for a while. And he returned to his native village in 1619, only to find that his entire tribe had been wiped out by an infection, possibly smallpox. The village that the Pilgrims established their settlement near was Tisquantum, or Squanto's village. And he was fluent in English, having lived amongst the English for a number of years. Samoset did speak some English, and these colonists made the acquaintance of Samoset first, and then Samoset brought Squanto to them, and together these guys taught these English colonists how to survive. Eventually, after surviving that first year, the Pilgrims would celebrate a Thanksgiving with the Patuxet band of the Wampanoag tribe, who Squanto had been adopted into since his own people were all dead. And there we have, we've had two artistic depictions of this. What it was really like, nobody really knows. But that first celebration of Thanksgiving was hopeful. Unfortunately, the good relations between the Pilgrims and Native Americans was not to last. Pilgrim community mostly were farmers and family members. They worked together. There was a lot of work to be done in order to create a situation in which they could all survive. Women in the community cooked, sewed clothing, wove wool. They had more legal rights than women in England did. They had the right to speak out for themselves. They could own property, which women in England could not do. Property ownership for these women was important, though, because the conditions that they were living in often meant that the men sometimes did not survive, and women had to have rights to do things as well. So this is where they had a place where they could actually have some sense of independence, unlike what they would have had in England. The Puritans were dissenters. That is, they disagreed with official opinions and church actions in England, which was not a safe thing for them to do, because if you belonged to the Church of England, the head of the church was the king, or the queen, but generally the king. And so if you defied the church, then you were defying the king, and that is never a safe thing to do. Many thousands of Puritans left England during the Great Migration, between 1629 and 1640. Puritan colonists were led initially by John Winthrop, who went to Massachusetts to seek religious freedom. That is, they sought freedom from the rules of the king, essentially, the king being the leader of the church, and they would establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. John Winthrop once said, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." And what John Winthrop was saying here is, when he refers to them as being as seen as a city upon the hill, he's saying that what they are out to create is a better society, a better kind of existence, and that all the world will be looking upon them. And this idea of creating a better society it's really what being an American ultimately is all about. That we are always trying to improve ourselves, that we are always trying to make that better society that can serve as an example to others. We're not always successful at it, but it's something that is part of our tradition. Focus question number 1. Explain why the Pilgrims and Puritans came to America to avoid religious persecution. Main idea 2. Religion and government were closely linked in the New England colonies. They established a general court that turned into a type of self-government. Again, the first colonists in the New England area were outside of the jurisdiction or outside of the rule of the Virginia Company, and so they had to create their own government. Government leaders were also church members. They were also leaders of the church. And dissenters, or people who disagreed with the way the church or the colony was being run, were often forced out. That is, they were banished or expelled. Religious conflicts within the community included conflicts with religious leaders like Thomas Hooker, who led his followers to found a colony called Connecticut to make government more democratic. Thomas Hooker believed that the people of the colony had to have more of a voice in how the colony was run, and for that he was banished. And he and his followers left, and they founded a colony of their own, which is today the state of Connecticut. He is considered to be the founding father of American democracy. It is his idea that the people must have a voice that largely drives our form of government and our society to this very day. Roger Williams, another leader who was banished, founded Providence, which would eventually become the state of Rhode Island. Roger Williams believed in the separation of church and state, that the church and the state government cannot be one and the same. The church is the church, the state is the state, and the two must remain separate from each other. And for this belief, he was banished. Anne Hutchinson, a woman of all things, questioned the teaching of religious leaders. She believed in the idea that you did not have to have a priest or a pastor or anybody to interpret the Word of God for you, that you could know the Word of God inside your own heart, and that since God gave us our own intellect and freedom of will, that we had the ability to choose between right and wrong as individuals, and it was up to each of us to do so. Not only that, she had this crazy idea about equality between men and women, which was, crazy talk at the time. And so because of that, she was forced out of the colony as well. Eventually, she and her followers moved south of the Massachusetts Bay, and they ended up in the Providence colony with Roger Williams and his followers. Later on, though, she was killed in a Native American attack on the colony, and that was the end of her. In 1692, the thing that breaks the power of the Puritan church particularly takes place in Salem, a Puritan community, and there they held the largest number of witchcraft trials. These trials were actually inspired. Oops, I really need to rearrange this. So this statue here is of Thomas Hooker, and there we have Roger Williams, and here we have one of Anne Hutchinson. And finally, to the Salem witch trials. Now, back to that. The Salem witch trials kicked off because of a group of girls, teenage girls, began telling stories about possession, demonic possession, and witchcraft, and they began accusing people in the community of being witches. And the clergy, who also happened to be the government of Salem, they began taking this very seriously, and they held a series of trials. The outcome of the trials were that 19 people were hung, as well as were 2 dogs who were accused of being witches' familiars. And one man was pressed to death. That is, he was crushed by having rocks piled upon him. This man refused to confess to practicing witchcraft, and so they tortured him essentially until he died. And it wasn't until the girls started accusing members of the general court, members of the clergy, of being witches, that the court said, whoa, 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 we can't be witches. We are God's elect. We are chosen by God to do what we are doing. And at that point, the community turned upon them because it's like, hey, wait a minute. We just killed all of these people on your say-so because these girls said that they were witches, but now they accuse you of being witches, and suddenly that can't possibly be the truth, and the girls are all lying. And this kind of broke the power of the Puritan church and drove a lot of people away from it. Focus question number 2. How were religion and government closely linked in the New England colonies? Main idea 3. The New England economy was based on trade and farming. Under farming, unlike the southern colonies, the environment in New England was pretty harsh, relatively speaking. It was a harsh climate. Soil was very rocky. The stones that you could find in the soil in the New England colonies was actually a reminder, although nobody at the time would have known about this. It was a reminder of the fact that 10,000 years earlier, glaciers had covered the area where the Massachusetts colony was at. And when the glaciers melted and retreated, what got left behind was all of the rock and debris that the glaciers had crushed up and brought with them as they pushed south during the Ice Age. And that rock eventually worked its way into the soil of New England. And if you were an English farmer in the early 1600s and you tried to plow a field, you just ran into rocks all over the place. And so that meant that cash crop agriculture was really impossible. The soil just wasn't fit for it. Most farming families grew crops and raised animals for their own use, and really nothing more. If they had something left over, they might sell it to earn a little bit of extra money, but they weren't growing crops just to make money. Because of this, there was little need for slaves. Slavery was legal, but effectively it was not really practiced. There was no need for it, and so people tended not to own slaves. Trade. Merchants traded goods locally. They traded goods with other colonies and overseas. And what made transport of things that they were making locally to other places was the fact that New England basically was a gigantic forest. It was very heavily forested. There were lots of trees, lots of wood, and they would cut down these trees and use them to make boats. Eventually, it would get into shipbuilding, and the New Englanders then would become very influential merchants as time went on. By the 1700s, New England was actually quite successful as a colony built on trade. Fishing was also one of the region's leading industries, and again, you need boats and ships in order to do that. It started out with fishing. Later, New Englanders would be involved in hunting whales on the open ocean. And New England economically would become it would become very wealthy, actually. Kind of unusual from a colony that began with poor pilgrims who sold themselves into indentured servitude to get out of England. And as previously mentioned, shipbuilding would develop as an important industry. Focus question number 3. In what ways was the New England economy based on trade and farming? Main idea 4. Education was important in the New England colonies. Public education. Communities in New England established their own town schools. Students used a textbook called the New England Primer, which had stories from the Bible. The whole point of providing education to children was teaching them to read so that they could access the Word of God, so that they could have a personal relationship with God by reading the Bible. The availability of schooling varied in the colonies. Most children, however, stopped education after the elementary grades. Once they learned how to read and write, there was little need seen for actually providing higher education. Children were expected to go to work and be productive. There were some exceptions, however. Higher education did begin in the New England colonies. Higher education was important to them. It just wasn't seen as being for everybody. John Harvard and the General Court in the Massachusetts Bay Colony founded Harvard College in 1636, which today is Harvard University, one of the most highly renowned universities in the world. The College of William and Mary was founded in Virginia in 1693. Now, Virginia is a southern colony, and education in the South was not as highly valued as it was in New England. Because of this, institutions of higher learning were not founded in the South until many decades after they were founded in the North. Focus question number 4. Why was education so important in the New England colonies? The essential question for the New England colonies. Explain why English colonists traveled to New England to gain religious freedom and how they developed a new society based upon their religious beliefs.